In this lesson, we're going to be making the orchid lip, throat, and column. We're going to be working with basic frame, scallops, and then also a crossover loop to make the little column there. And we also have a shading pattern going on, so this is the most complicated component that we're going to be making throughout this class. Now the design that I chose for this component is going to be the same throughout all of the different colorways. So the pink, the yellow, and the green orchid all had the exact same lip, throat, and column piece. Let's look at these materials. The main color that we're going to be using is an opaque white rainbow, and then we have some markings in a transparent hot pink or raspberry color, and then just a little tiny bit of an opaque light yellow. I do highly recommend that you work with a 26 gauge wire when making this component. If you're looking at my original Cymbidium orchid pattern, which was the larger sized one, the normal sized one, that one used a 24 gauge wire, but since we're miniaturizing this and we're making a smaller component size, the 26 gauge wire is going to work a whole lot better to make these scallops and then also to mold the smaller sized component afterwards into the shape that it needs to be in. So to make all this molding and folding and everything to get it to do this nicely, a thinner wire is going to work a little bit better. And I just use silver for mine. You could use white if you already have white on hand, but I just use silver. Now we also are going to assemble the flower because we made the flowers in the last lesson. So we're going to assemble the flower in this lesson as well. So go ahead and grab your assembly materials. You'll want some floral tape, some 30 gauge wire, any color will do just fine. You can use the leaf lacing wire or just any 30 gauge wire that you have on hand. You're going to want the embroidery floss and then 5 petals for each flower that you're making. Just to make sure that you guys can see everything clearly what I'm doing, I'm going to switch a couple colors here. My white beads have turned into orange beads. So anytime you see me using an orange bead, you should be using white. And I'm also going to use a hot pink wire instead of the silver wire. Again, just to make sure that you can see what I'm doing a little bit better. Now let's set up this basic frame first. I usually do that before cutting any wire off the spool. We're going to start with 3 white beads and then 3 of the pink beads. Make a little loop in the end of your wire so your beads won't come off. And then we're going to move the beads so they're about somewhere around 1/2 inch or so away from the end of the wire. Now to make the bottom wire, we need somewhere around 6 inches of wire that we're going to fold into a loop so that our bottom loop and bottom wire end up being about 3 inches long. I'm just going to pinch and hold that in place so my top wire doesn't shrink. And then twist these 2 wires together below to make the bottom wire. Oh, I still need that, just kidding. Okay. Now because we are working with multiple colors of beads and we're working with scallops, we're going to cut wire off of the spool. For this component, we need somewhere around 20 inches of wire. I always recommend that you cut a little bit extra, at least the first couple times that you make a piece, because you might use a little bit more or a little bit less than the designer did, and that's completely normal. Straighten out my frame. All right, so I've got my frame set up and we're ready to start row 2. Now before we go any further, I do need to preface something here. Shading patterns in French beading, especially if they have like a count where they tell you a specific number of beads in each row, those counts are a guideline. They are not meant to be taken perfectly seriously because French beading is not like bead weaving. We're not all going to use exactly the same bead counts for each row. That's just due to maybe you're using a different bead brand than I do, so they're different shapes, or even just personal technique. The way that you wrap, your exact angles, your tension, everything like that can affect how many beads are in a row, so your counts might not be exactly the same. All you got to do is to be able to adjust so that the markings line up. Okay, and that's all that's important in French beading. So you can use those counts in the pattern, but use them as a guideline, not as something that's strict. Okay. Now, also, after saying that, I will also say that some markings do kind of line up. If the marking that you're trying to make is at the beginning of the row or the end of the row, they're usually going to be pretty close to what the designer did. So you can use those counts, and I try to shift, how do I explain this? I try to shift the non-important colors. I call them fill colors because the exact count doesn't matter. So I try to write my patterns so that the ones that do matter have the counts, and then the discrepancy is shifted into the fill color. So I write my patterns very specifically to help with that. But let me show you here on screen here. Now row 2 here is going to end with 3 white beads preceded by 3 pink beads. And we do need 3 white and 3 pink at the end. But we might not get that if we start the count at the beginning. So what we're going to do is we're going to fill out the row entirely with the white beads first. This is just going to help us to measure the length of the row. And then we're actually going to subtract 6 beads for the markings. So it's 3 white beads and then 3 pink beads. All right. So that will make sure that we have enough space to be able to make 3 pink and then 3 white. And that's also something that you might need to fiddle with depending on your beads, because one Toho bead is not the same as one Miyuki bead. So that's something else that you're going to have to play with based on the beads that you're working with. Okay. Now we are wrapping round top, which means we need to do a 90-degree angle wrap, which is different than the 45-degree angle wrap that we've been using throughout this whole class. So we're still going to come over the front of the top wire just like we did before, but we're going to come over at a 90-degree angle instead of a 45-degree angle. And then while wrapping, we're going to keep our wire kind of flat. I usually use my thumb to kind of push down right there and then wrap around, maintaining a 90-degree angle the entire time around. If you look closely at this wrap here, let me see if I can get it to focus there. The 2 little parts of the wrap, the bottom half of the wrap and the top half of the wrap, those 2 little wires are squished close together and they're touching. And that's how you're going to get a 90-degree angle wrap. All right, so there's row 2. Now let's start row 3. Now row 3 has the markings at the beginning. This is the beginning of row 3 is at the top wire and the ending of the row is at the bottom. The markings are at the beginning, so we can just start the row instead of having to measure and then reduce. So we're going to start with 3 white and then 3 pink. And then we're going to fill out the rest of the row with white beads. And this is a fill color. You might use a different number than what's shown in my photos if you're looking at the PDF pattern, or more or less beads than what I'm showing here on screen as well. So I'm just going to measure out my beads so they fill out the row entirely. And we're wrapping pointed bottom, so I'm going to come over the front at a 45-degree angle and make a 45-degree angle wrap. We have completed the basic frame portion of the petal, and now we're going to start with scallops. So we're going to start the up row of the first scallop with 2 white, 1 pink, and then we're going to fill out the rest of the row with white just for now. We have a marking at the end of the row that we need to do, as well as marking at the beginning of the row, so the fill color is right in the middle. Now we're going to use the fill color to help us measure the full length of the row. Our scallop is going to attach to the side of row 2, 3 beads down from the top. That's why we needed those 3 white beads at the end of row 2, is because that's our scallop count. And we want the white markings to make a complete edging around the outside of the throat, so we do need 3 there to make sure that the white ends up being all the way around the pink. Okay, so we're going to measure the scallop to right there. We want the top of the scallop to be even with or directly below that 3rd bead that we're going to be right below that bead where we're going to be attaching the scallop. If I had a bead here that just goes like halfway past that scallop point, I'm still going to detract that bead because that's going to take us past it. All right, I've removed all of the excess beads off of my working wire. What I'm going to do here first is I'm going to straighten out my working wire, and I do that just by running my fingers along it. This just helps it to be easier to control, so it's less likely to do things that you don't want it to do, like make a kink. So I've got my wire straight, and then I've kind of looped it back towards my work, so it's a very controlled loop. I'm going to insert the wire into the back side of the petal, right there between the basic row and row number 2. And I'm going to pull my wire all the way through to the front, And I want this wire to catch right below that third bead. That's why I've got my thumbnail here marking that spot. That's going to help me to guide the wire between the correct beads. So just like that. And then we're going to pull the wire over to the side like so. So the up row of scallop 1 is completed, and now we're going to do the down row. Oh, I did it again. I actually forgot. I've taken this apart a couple times because I keep forgetting to do the marking at the end of this scallop 1. Okay, I'm going to undo that real quick. All right, there's actually a pink marking at the end of scallop 1 up row. We're going to subtract the last 2 white beads. Those were just there to help us measure the length of the row. And then we're going to replace them with 2 pink beads. All right, then we're going to do the scallop. Mark that spot with my thumbnail, straighten out my working wire so it's a controlled loop pointing back towards my work. Insert into the back, pull all the way through, and then latch that wire right there below the third bead. All right, so the up row of scallop 2 should look like this. And now we're ready to make the down row, which is going to go back down to the bottom wire. We're going to start the down row of scallop 1 with 6 white beads, followed by 1 pink bead, 4 white beads, another pink bead, and then we're going to fill out the remainder of the row with white, and that's usually just 1 white bead for me, but add a couple extra just in case so you can line up your rows the way you need to. I'm going to make sure that my beads, before I go back down to the bottom wire, I'm going to make sure that they're all the way covering that scallop wire. So give a nice little push there so your wire gets covered completely. And then we're going to fold down the side, down to the bottom wire. And we are wrapping at a 45-degree angle at this bottom wire, so I'm going to bring my working wire over the front of the bottom wire at a 45-degree angle. And then I'm going to measure out my beads, and I did end up with just 1 white bead there at the end, but yours might be a little bit different depending on how everything's lining up. And then we're going to do a 45-degree angle wrap. And I'm going to remove beads off of my working wire again because we've got to do something that I call repositioning the working wire. As you can see right now, this working wire is right below the scallop, the 2 rows in our scallop. And if I just go straight back up and try to do a scallop on this other side, there's going to be this awkward little gap right here between my rows. And this happens because there are 2 rows of beads on the same side of the bottom wire without another row between them. So what we're going to do is we're going to weave this working wire upward a row so that it does exit between them. So we're just going to, kind of very similar to the scallop, we're going to insert the wire into the back side of the petal right between those 2 rows at the bottom of the working wire, and then pull them all the way through. And I kind of pinch and hold while I'm doing this, just so that when I'm pulling, I need to pull a little bit strongly here to get a nice tight wrap here, that I'm not going to mess up my petal. So I kind of pinch and hold tightly here so I'm not going to wonkify anything as I'm pulling and tugging. Now our working wire is exiting between those 2 rows of beads there in that scallop. So we're in position to start the scallop on the opposite side of the lip. This one is going to be, we want the markings in the up row. This is scallop 2 up row. We want the markings to be somewhat symmetrical, as close as we can make it, to the markings in the up row of scallop 1. So we might need to adjust some of the counts here and just kind of watch your beads as you're working through it and make any adjustments as needed. Now I'm going to start with 3 white beads and then a pink bead, and I'm going to stop there and I'm going to check to see if it's at least close to being somewhat symmetrical. Right there, and that is, so I don't have to adjust anything. If I did need to adjust something, I could either add or subtract a white bead in front of the pink bead to make them kind of line up a little bit better. And then we're going to fill out the rest of the row with white just for now, just so that we can measure the full length. And that will help us figure out where the pink beads at the end need to be. So we're going to make a 3 count scallop again. So the 3 beads that started row 3 over here were important because we need that to be our scallop count there. So we're going to measure the row so that the top bead in the up row kind of sits right below that 3 bead point on row 3. Pinch and hold there, remove any excess beads off of the spool, and then I'm going to subtract 2 of the white beads and replace them with 2 pink beads. And then I'm going to do my scallop. So I'm going to pinch and hold that row in place, make sure my working wire, straighten it out, and then loop it back towards my work just to make it more manageable and less unruly. Insert the wire into the back right between the basic row and row number 3, and then pull the wire through. And sometimes I use my fingers here on the working wire just to kind of guide it through a little bit more. Gives me a little bit more control over the wire loop that's forming there. Make sure that your wire catches right between that 3rd and 4th bead in row 3, and then pull over to the side. So the up row of scallop number 2 is going to look like this. And now we're ready to make the down row, which is going to be as close to identical as this one as we can make it. So we're going to start out with 6B, or sorry, I'm looking at my notes here and I keep saying the numbers or letters. 6 white, and then 1 pink, 4 white, 1 pink, and I'm going to check that real fast just to make sure that everything's lining up here. And for this row, I'm checking with the down row of scallop number 1. So I'm just going to kind of line this up and make sure that everything is looking nice and it's going to sit properly where I want it to, and it is. So I'm just going to leave it the way it is, but you can adjust either the 6 white beads at the top or the 4 white beads in between the pink beads to make your little spots line up a little the way that they need to. And then we're going to fill out the rest of the row with white beads, however many fit. For me it's 3, but it might be a little bit different. Again, double check before you wrap that your beads are covering this little top part, this little wire here at the top of the scallop before you wrap. So double check that. And then we're wrapping a 45-degree angle at the bottom wire. Now, this scallop, because it's on the second side, we don't have 2 rows of beads at the bottom that aren't interrupted. All right, so we don't need to reposition our working wire on the second half of the lip, just on the first side. Now, these next scallops are a little bit different. We're going to take all white beads. And, oh, just kidding, these ones aren't. The next ones are. All right, all white beads now, from now on. We're going to put this one at 9 beads down from the top of the previous scallop. So we're going to count 3, 6, 9 beads. So that's going to put us right between those 2 pink spots. So we're going to be 2 beads below the pink spot and then 2 beads below or above that pink spot. So right there. Remove any excess beads off of the working wire. Straighten out your wire and loop it back towards your work. Insert the wire into the back side of the lip and pull it all the way through, watching carefully to make sure that this wire doesn't form a kink. If it does start forming a kink, stop immediately and try to straighten it back out before you tug any further. And we're going to pull this through and we're going to make sure that it sits right there between the 9th and 10th bead in the row, and then pull over to the side. So the up row of scallop number 3 is going to look like this. And then we're going to make the down row. And again, this one is going to be all in white, so I don't need to count beads. I'm just going to put on a bunch of white beads and then go down to the bottom wire. So I'm going to kind of lift my wire up a little bit and push down to make sure that those beads can get all the way down on top of that wire at the top of the scallop, and then fold down to the bottom wire. I'm going to twist a couple more times here to lengthen my bottom wire, and we're going to come over that bottom wire at a 45-degree angle, measure the row of beads, and then we're going to wrap a 45-degree angle wrap. And now we're on the first side again, so we've got 2 rows of beads on the same side of the bottom wire without one coming between them, so we're going to reposition the working wire. So we're just going to weave that up 1 row. And now the working wire will exit between those two rows, and we're in position to start our next scallop. And it's going to be exactly the same as the one on the other side. Now you can do a scallop count if you want to, counting 9 beads down from the top, but I'm just going to eyeball it. I'm going to put it in that same spot, 2 beads down from the pink bead, the top pink bead in this outer row, right there. And then I'm going to put my scallop right there. And then we're going to go down to the bottom wire. Again, all white beads. And I'm going to go ahead and string a lot more than just that so I have enough beads to do the up row of the next scallop as well. So I'm going to lift my wire just a little bit to make more room between the working wire and the edge of my petal. That way I can get my beads to scooch all the way down on top of the wire. Cover it completely and then wrap down to the bottom wire. Remember, we're making a pointed bottom, so we're going to wrap a 45-degree angle. Need more twists here. All right, now this scallop is the one that's a little bit different. This is scallop number 5, which we're doing on the first side. This one is going to be 1 bead above the previous scallop. Most scallops are going to have you continuously go down where you're counting from the top of the previous scallop. This one we're going to go 1 bead above this scallop, and that's going to give us kind of a thicker lobe on the side of our little lip here. All right, so I'm going to bring these beads up and above that scallop. And if you can't get these beads to sit nicely, you can go 2 beads above if you need to. So just use your best judgment there and see that I'm not going to be able to get that to sit nicely, so I'm going to go 1 bead above. That's fine, it'll be just fine. So I'm going to measure about to there and then insert into the back side of my petal. Again, I'm using my thumbnail kind of as a guide to make sure that my wire goes down between the right beads. So right there, 1 bead above the previous scallop, like that. And then we're going to go back down to the bottom wire, again, all white beads. All right, make sure your beads are all the way pushed down on top of the wire, and then fold down to the bottom wire again. Also make sure that the rows in your scallops don't bunch up on top of each other. We want them to sit flat beside each other, so I kind of pinch like this to make sure that my rows are sitting flat beside each other instead of bunching up. Measure out 45-degree angle wrap there, and wrap. And then we're going to reposition the working wire because again we are on the first side and we've got those 2 rows of beads on the same side of the working wire. And we're going to make that same scallop again on the other side of the lip. We're going to string all white beads. Push them all the way down so they cover the bottom wire. And then we're going to measure this scallop to 1 bead above the previous scallop. Remove excess beads. Enter wire into the back of the petal. Pull all the way through and then over to the side. And if you do tug and it separates your rows like this, just push them back together. It's wire, you can reshape it. All right, so there's the up row. This is scallop 6 is the last scallop. Up row of scallop 6 is done. We're going to make the down row. And again, that's all in white. Pinch and make sure my scallops are flat. And then wrap at the bottom wire. This is the last row that we're making this way, so I did double wrap there at my bottom wire. And I'm going to remove any excess white beads off of the spool, or off of my working wire. Now we aren't quite done yet, but the lip and throat portion is going to look like this. Now we're going to make what is called the column. It's like this little cylindrical shaped protrusion right in the middle of the orchid flower center. And we're going to be working with kind of a weird crossover loop. It's only a 3-row crossover loop. So we're going to start with 8 of the light yellow beads. And then we're going to string 4 of the pink beads. And then 8 more of the light yellow beads. This is going to make the starting loop for the crossover loop that we're making for the column. Now I just brought my working wire over to the right side just because it's more comfortable for me. It doesn't actually matter if you make this on the left side or the right side. It's all going to end up in the middle anyways. So if you prefer to work on the other side, it's just fine. Now I'm going to bring this down right beside my little throat, and I'm going to leave a little teeny tiny space there. I just need enough to be able to twist some wires and then wrap after I do the crossover row. So I'm going to pinch and hold. I usually put my thumb in front of the beads so that that little piece of wire does not shrink. And I'm going to fold this into the starting loop and then twist. 1, 2, just like that. And now we're going to make the crossover row. Now this crossover row is different than most crossover rows. This one is only going to cover the front, and then we're going to bare wire on the back because we just need 3 rows of beads here. We don't want it to be too thick. We're going to start out with 3 of the light yellow beads, and then we're going to fill out however many is left with the white beads, which are orange in my case. So I'm going to kind of push these beads down so that they cover that little wire there at the bottom completely. And then I'm going to bring these beads up right in between the 2 halves of that loop. So we're kind of filling in this hole, but it still sits on top. I'm going to bring the wire down between the 2 beads that are right in the middle of that starting loop. And then we're going to fold bare wire down the back. With most crossovers, you would have more beads here along the back side, but this time we're just going to do wire back there. I'm going to pinch and hold this in place, and then I'm going to double wrap right around that single wire just to secure the crossover row on my little loop. All right, then I'm going to double wrap the working wire again around the twisted bottom wire from my basic frame. That's just going to secure everything and keep everything in place. And I didn't say what I was doing there. I'm going to turn this little column so that the wire is going to be pointing down towards the lip and throat component, so it will look like this. All right, and so that wire is going to be under there. It won't be exposed in your finished plant. And we've just got 3 little rows of beads up there making the column. All right, we are going to reduce to 2 bottom wires, and that means we're going to cut off the working wire right there. We're going to cut open the bottom loop off to the side. And I do want to make sure that I have a few twists here in my bottom wire because that's going to give something for the assembly wire to grip onto. And then we also need to cut this top wire short and then fold it to the back side of the lip. Now the last portion of this is that we're going to shape this lip and column. Right now it's flat. So we're going to do some folding and bending in order to get it into the right shape. First thing that we're going to do is to take these thicker lobes and kind of fold them upward like this so that they kind of surround the column. They kind of make little walls right around that little column. And then we're going to take the little lip part in front and fold it down like this. And you might need to adjust things a little bit as you go. All right, so the finished little component will look like this from the side and then like this from the front. All right, so when you're finished, your orchid center is going to look like this. And you need 1 for each flower. If you're making a stem the same size as the one that I made, that means you're going to need 5 of these. Now that we've got all of our flower components made, we can just go ahead and put the flowers together. Now, normally I save assembly for the last lesson. We just go in one big chunk all together. But this time I decided to do something different and just kind of break it up a little bit. Let me know in the comments if you guys prefer to kind of assemble as we have the pieces made, or if you would rather have assembly be one lesson at the end of the class. Let me know what you guys think. All right, so I've got 5 petals that we made from the previous lesson, and then I've got one of the flower centers here. What we're going to do first is we're going to cut a couple feet of this 30 gauge wire, and we're just going to cut it right off of the spool. I think you only need like 1.5, 2 feet there will be plenty. I'm going to straighten it out so it's a little bit easier to work with. Flower center is going to be the first component, so I'm going to pick that up, and then 2 petals. And I'm going to bend the stem wires back 90 degrees like this on both of these petals. And remember, the back side is the one where all these little wire wraps are showing. So that's the back side of the petal. And the front side should be just beads. And we're going to place these on each side, kind of sticking out like little ears, going outward from the throat like this. And I'm going to hold them. And to line them up properly, I'm going to make sure that the bottom of these little petals is kind of pressed right against the last of the beads on the throat. I don't really want there to be a gap. So make sure that you are pressed up right close against the flower center. I'm pinching and holding all of these together. This is very important. You don't want to let go because even after we wrap this a couple times, it's still not going to be secure enough to let go of. All right, so pinch and hold this together. Now we're going to take this little assembly wire that we've cut off of the little spool, and we're going to press it right against the stem wire, just a little tail there, right against the bottom, kind of like we did with the floss for the buds. Have a little tail sticking down, and then we're going to wrap over that to secure it as we go. And then we're going to start with the wire kind of right below where those little petals are. We're going to wind really, really tightly, kind of pull these close together, and take a minute to make sure everything is in its proper place. And then we're going to wind very, very tightly right below the petals. We don't want to go down any further than that just yet. So we're going to hold that there. Now they aren't completely secure yet, so I'm still not letting go of these little stem wires. We're going to add in the next 3 petals. I'm going to do 3 at a time because I can hold 3 at a time. If you have any trouble holding all 3 of these next petals in place, then just add 1 petal at a time, wrap it, and then add the last 2. All right, so we're going to do 1. I'm going to bend that back again, and this one I'm going to place right at the top, right between those 2 petals, and I want to make sure that it's also behind those petals, so right below them, but behind. I don't want it to come in front of. That's not how orchid petals overlap. It should be situated kind of a little bit behind them, but we still don't want any of these little wire wraps to show. So, like that. I'm going to lift my fingers up just a little bit there and put that stem wire in place. And then we're going to add in the 2 bottom petals. Again, I'm doing it all at once. You don't have to. Technically, these 2 are the only ones that are petals, and then the top one and the bottom ones are actually sepals, but I'm just going to call them all petals. And this one's going to be off to the side. Again, behind the petals. Oops, sorry, I'm off screen there. So this one that I've just added on there, I'm just going to carefully lift up my finger, slide it in. And this one is going to be, again, behind the petal and kind of off to the side. We don't want it to stick straight down, but kind of off at an angle. And then this petal is going to go on this side the same way, like this. Shift things around in your fingers to make sure that they are all sitting nicely. All right. Now also make sure that you don't have a gap between the layers. You don't want these to be too far down because then there's going to be spacing in your flower that you don't want. So it's going to be like this. And then I'm going to wrap again right there. 1, 2, 3, just right below where those petals are. Now that I've got everything attached, I'm going to take this assembly wire and wrap down a little ways. This is where having all of those little twists in your working, or the stem wires on each of your little petals and things is going to help. is because the working wire is going to be able to grab those a little bit easier than a smooth wire. If your wire is smooth, then this wire kind of slides. The assembly wire can slide up and down a little bit more, and you don't really want that. You want it to hold in place. So we just need to go down a little ways here, like so. And then I'm just going to pull out a couple of wires and wrap the end of the assembly wire really tightly around those. That's just going to tie it off. And then I can cut the assembly wire off and push those back down. All right, so I can go through here and kind of reshape things. I think I have like one too many beads in that row, so I'm just going to shape it nicely to try and make it look like it fits a little bit better. All right, so that's what the flower should look like so far. We're going to wrap the stem just like we did for the bud with floral tape. And this is floral tape that I cut off of the little roll and then cut in half to make it skinnier. Stretch the end of my tape and then wrap it around the flower stem and stick it to itself on the other side. You might need to squeeze and pinch right here while rolling and spinning the stem in your hand to try and get that tape to stick to itself. We're going to stretch, angle downward, and spin, stretch, spin, stretch, spin, all the way down. And before you get all the way to the end, make sure that your little stem wires aren't ending all in the exact same spot. You do want about 1 inch to 1.5 inches here where they're all the same length, and then they start ending. So I'm going to make sure that they aren't dropping off all at the same spot. That's going to help us during assembly of the stem, just so that we don't get, our stem is going to kind of taper down in width slowly rather than all ending at the same spot. It just helps with the appearance of your finished stem. All right, wrap all the way down there. And then just like the bud, we're also going to wrap the stem, got a tangled mess here, with embroidery floss. So I'm going to cut a couple feet off of the skein, and then I'm going to divide it into 2 3-strand sections. All right. That just gives me a thinner floss. I have an easier time getting a nice smooth wrap, especially on smaller components like this if I use just a 3-strand floss. So we're going to wrap this just like we did the bud. We're going to leave a small tail, which we're going to press against the stem. I'm just going to kind of pinch it in place with my thumb there so that when I start my wraps, it's going to start right below the flower. Just keep wrapping around. Make sure that you're getting full coverage there. Untwist your little floss threads so that they lay flat and directly beside each other. And then we're going to, once it feels like it's nice and secure and you can tug it and it won't come off, you can kind of flip it around and then just spin your stem like this. And we're going to floss down. Let me check my notes here. How long did I go down? About 1 inch-ish. 2.5 centimeters. Somewhere around there. It doesn't need to be exact. These are natural components. They can have a slightly longer stem or a slightly shorter stem. All right, so about right there is fine. And then I'm going to tie off my floss. I loop the end back over the stem and then pull the end through the loop. And that'll make enough of a knot to help hold it still until assembly, and then I can just cut that short. All right, so I'm going to go through here and reshape anything that might have gotten a little bit wonky, and I'm going to kind of give just a little bit of a curl to some of my petals. Maybe I'll bend this one backwards. This one backwards, I'm kind of lifting up and curling back so that it comes forward and then curls back like that. right, so there is the finished flower. Now for my stems, I made 4 of them like this, where the flower was completely opened and bloomed like this. And I also made one where the flower it's like a bud that's beginning to open but hasn't fully opened. So let me show you the difference with that one. Now to assemble a flower that is partially closed, you're going to start by turning the petals backwards so that the back sides of the petals are going to face forward toward the flower center. So otherwise the assembly was exactly the same. And then we're going to just curl the petals inward so they're kind of closing a little bit around the flower center. Just like that. Now for my flower stems, I chose to make 4 of my flowers open and then 1 flower closed. Now, obviously you could make them all open if you prefer because of the same materials, you just need to flip the petals around. But that was just one little detail that I decided to include on my stems. Now that's it for the flowers. In our next lesson, we're going to be learning how to make the miniature Cymbidium orchid leaves.